LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Bill Still, who joins us to discuss his new film, Jekyll Island, The Truth Behind the Federal Reserve. What's the real problem with the world economy? It's debt. Too much personal debt, too much corporate debt, and most importantly, too much government debt. People have a natural tendency to want to spend now and pay later, and governments are no different. The problem is that government money mostly comes from just two sources, taxation and borrowing. Governments can either raise taxes to cover their reckless spending, or borrow from private banks and continue to kick the financial can down the road. Unfortunately, the vast sums governments owe to these private for-profit banks continually attracts interest, and this mathematically unpayable debt is now strangling the life out of the economy of every nation on earth. But crucially, it's not just the sheer volume of interest paid to the banks, it's the control over the political process that this debt gives them. We can never fix the instability in the world economic system until we forbid government borrowing. Economic instability favours banks and speculators, whereas economic stability favours the people. If banks control the creation of money, there is no way there will ever be a stable economic system. The good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. Banks don't need to be in control. Governments don't need to borrow. Governments do not need a national debt. Hello and welcome, Bill, and thank you so much for joining us once again on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
We're going to talk today about your documentary, Jekyll Island, The Truth Behind the Federal Reserve. Before we dive into that, just give listeners a little potted resume about your work with particular regard to monetary reform.
Oh, gee, I started, I kind of knew the basics when I wrote my first book in 1990, but then I actually wrote a book on the topic in 1992 that later a gentleman read that book and decided, which the title of the book was called On the Horns of the Beast, the Federal Reserve and the New World Order. A gentleman read that book and got very excited about it and called them and said, well, we need to get this out to a wider audience. So what do we do? And I said, well, let's make a documentary video. And he said, okay. And so that became The Money Masters. That was released in early 1996. And then I did The Secret of Oz in 2010, which won Best Documentary of 2010 at one international film festival and won many other awards at other film festivals. And so that brings us up to Jekyll Island, which we shot last year.
Now, just to clarify for some listeners, there'll be new listeners on here, there'll be people who heard your previous interview that we did. This documentary was completed last year, but you wanted to gain a bit more traction, so you've edited this down somewhat and you're going for a relaunch.
Right. We've edited it down to 88 minutes, I think, so it's under the 90-minute mark. And plus that it includes additional information like that there was a wonderful interview that I stumbled across when I was in Israel with an Israeli lawyer who explained how the banks basically bought off the Israeli Knesset because he was the lawyer that did it. So that's now included in the latest version.
Yeah, that was a remarkably frank interview. I was quite surprised by that. For people who don't know, maybe people tuning in here going, Federal Reserve, I kind of know what that is. It comes up on the news. People will intuitively understand, even if they've never looked at it, that we've got enormous problems with our economic system. Just boil this down, set it out for people. Imagine they've got a DVD, a documentary, they flip it over, they read the blurb on the back, just so people we're all on the same page.
Well, the problem is not the problem is that most people think that the government creates the money, when in fact that's not the case. In virtually every nation on the planet, governments create less than 3% of the money supply, typically the coins in your pocket only. All other money is created one way or another by banks as interest-bearing debts. That takes the seigniorage of the money supply away from the government. Number one, the seigniorage means the profit made from making a nation's money. If, for example, I think it costs 3 cents to produce a $100 bill, and of course, so the government would derive $99.97 worth of profit. But that's not the most important part. The most important part is also when the government creates its own money, it controls the quantity for the benefit of the government, we the people, in general. And what we have now, the situation that's slowly evolved over the past couple of hundred years, is that banks now create all of a nation's money supply and thereby control the quantity that's in circulation. And guess what? Since banks are commercial entities, they do not control the quantity of the money supply for the benefit of we the people of the individual nation. They control the quantity of the money supply as they must, because they're corporations, for the benefit of their corporate stockholders. The Federal Reserve is just there to make it appear that a government agency is in control of the quantity of the money supply in the United States, when in fact the Fed is a private corporation, not just by some speculation, but by their own admission, not just by their own admission, but by numerous rulings by federal courts in the United States. So therefore, you have a situation where this private corporation, the Federal Reserve, is attempting to control the quantity of the American money supply. And guess what? Since they're a private corporation, guess who their stockholders are? The banks, who are doing the manufacturing of the money out of nothing. And so thereby, the Fed is not actually controlling the banks for the benefit of the United States of America. They are just there to make it appear that the government is controlling the quantity of money that the commercial banks create, which is absolutely not the case. In 2008, during congressional investigations of the crash of 2007-2008, we found out that instead of banks having a 10% reserve, in other words, only creating 9 times as much money as they actually had, we found out that in the case of the big banks, J.P. Morgan and Citibank, they were creating 52 times the amount of money that they actually had in reserve. In the case of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, they were creating 80 times as much. And in the case of the big trading derivatives trading houses, such as Goldman Sachs, they were creating 333 times the amount of money they actually had. So this was totally illegal. No one's gone to jail for it, obviously, and they continue to do it to this day. The example is, if you go into your bank and you take out a mortgage, on the day that mortgage finalizes, closes is the term, does the banker go back in the back room and get a giant bag of $100 bills and come out and flop it on the desk and give it to you? No, that's not the way it works. The banker opens an account in your name and just puts numbers, electronic numbers, in that account. They don't actually loan you any real money that they have in their vault. They are empowered by the Federal Reserve Act to just put numbers in your account. Thereby, at that instant, they are literally creating the money out of nothing. And that's where the problem is.
Never mind the huge fractional proportions that you were speaking of there a moment ago, some of those banks. This basic system is like an affront to the intellect, to decency. It's so far removed from what most people I know certainly believe happens, that you and I go to work, we pay our salary into the bank lends that out and makes a little bit on top. It's so far removed from that. But the history of this goes back centuries. I mean, right back into to Europe and maybe even beyond. You can certainly tell folks better than me. In the United States itself, there was one of the main battlegrounds over the centuries. Governments versus central banks took place around, we think of President Andrew Jackson, for example. So perhaps you could trace, as your film does in great detail, just briefly the kind of historical roots of this corruption.
Well, it goes all the way back into about 1,000 years ago, when goldsmiths decided that they would offer a service, later known as a bank, where they would keep people's gold coins in their bank and provide them with paper receipts for the gold coins, and thereby the paper receipts were easier to hide, and so the gold coins wouldn't be stolen if you were traveling some distance to a merchant going to trade. Lots of times your gold coins were stolen. So they would create these paper receipts, and the paper receipts then began to trade as money. Well, of course, lots of times the goldsmiths would, guess what? They'd create money out of nothing by creating more paper receipts than they actually had gold in their banks. Well, what this did was allowed these goldsmiths to actually become the money creation process. And lots of times it was when it was discovered that an individual goldsmith was creating more paper receipts than he had gold, everybody would run to the goldsmith and try to withdraw their gold. Some people wouldn't be able to get all their gold, and so they'd pull the goldsmith out and hang him. But in the meantime, these goldsmiths were controlling the quantity of money. And it came to the attention of King Henry of England in 1100 AD that through this process, goldsmiths could, by acting in concert, threaten the monarch by saying, look, we can either loan out, if we create loans out of our paper receipts, and lend out a whole bunch into the economy, your economy thrives and everybody has lots of money and everybody's happy with the king. But if we don't like what the king's doing, we can call in all those paper receipt loans. Thereby the economy goes into a depression, and guess who gets blamed? The king. So the king didn't like that. King Henry didn't like that, so he decided to create his own form of money that was not based on the goldsmith's gold, that was not based on any value-backed currency. It was merely money that circulated for the public benefit, in the public interest, without interest. And these were called tally sticks. They were simply sticks of wood with notches cut in one side to denote the denomination. Then the sticks were split down the middle. The king would keep one half. The other half was spent into circulation or initially used as a receipt for payment of real estate taxes. And these began to trade as money, and they were outside of the hands of the goldsmiths. Well, this worked great, and that's what allowed this tiny island without many natural resources at all, namely England, to eventually become the British Empire, where the sun never set on the British Empire. In other words, they worked great. And they worked for almost 700 years until finally the goldsmiths convinced the British government that, you've got a lot of wars here. You really need to just quit this nonsense about creating your own money and borrow money from us bankers. And this was the creation of the Bank of England, and then that system, that template, spread throughout the land, spread throughout the world, and that's what we have today. And so we're now on essentially what's called a debt-based monetary system, where all money is created as an interest-bearing debt instead of being created in the interest of we the people without such debt. This whole notion that banks are simply intermediaries between savers who save their money in the bank and borrowers who wish to borrow that money is a completely contrived notion and no longer has any basis in reality, and that's the problem.
So money created as debt therefore needs to be paid back in all cases. But if the system is creating the principal but not the interest, then you get into some severe numerical problems.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to keep finding new borrowers and expanding the money supply to keep what is essentially the world's largest Ponzi scheme alive. But even beyond the Ponzi aspect of it, it allows someone other than the government, and the government is merely we the people who corporately form these things called sovereign nations to operate in our best interest, as opposed to the best interest of an oligarchy of goldsmiths. And it prevents us from being in control of the money supply. It lets the oligarchy be in control of the money supply. And so it works against human freedom, this 2,500-year march of human beings to try to create governments of, by, and for the people to maximize human freedom. This debt money creation system is completely opposed to that, whether or not they like to admit it.
Some people will be saying we've got these enormous problems we're facing with the environment, for example, energy, population, well, just all sorts of issues, a laundry list of stuff on and on. And they may be thinking to themselves, monetary reform, yes, we hear what you've said, system should be reformed. But in fact, the economic system acutely affects so much of the rest of the world and generates actually quite a lot of the problems we face, because the way it's structured, it has detached the money system from actual physical reality in terms of resources, in terms of the environment, in terms of everything.
Well, it causes a necessary continuing expansion of, for example, housing starts. The continuing expansion of the population to feed this ever burgeoning debt money system, because the interest is continuing to expand, and so you have to keep new customers making new loans because you're essentially rolling over the debt over and over again, and so this just completely rolls over any environmental concerns ultimately. And also rolls over any concerns about human rights or human freedom. The two just cannot coexist. So, until this is fixed, we're going to see nothing but lip service given to environmental issues and lip service given to effective democracies. We're going to see increasing levels of autocracy, of oligarchy, of plutocracy, and decreasing levels of human freedom, as much as they will try to disguise that.
Now, I've lived long enough to see a number of what the news people and economists like to call recessions, the cycle of boom and bust. And this is portrayed very much in the mainstream media and by said economists to be a sort of a natural cycle, but that's always seemed counterintuitive to me. It's like, why should it be that way? It doesn't make any sense. Presumably, as much as people like boom times, nobody wants a bust. So if it's a human system designed and controlled by humans, why does it go into a bust? But of course, there's lying in the monetary system as it is, there's kind of the seeds of this, and it makes it inevitable in a way.
Yeah, it's absolutely inevitable. And it's absolutely correctable as well. You don't have to have this so-called monetary cycle. It's just a matter of controlling the quantity of money in the system. And if we, the people, are able to take back the creation of our own sovereign money, and it's not that I'm opposed to banks. We need banks to intermediate between borrowers and lenders to provide checking account services and many other services for which we will have to pay. But this notion that banks get to create money out of nothing, essentially counterfeiting the national money supply, and worst of all, through this excess money, being able to control the political system, which they ultimately will control for their own benefit, that just works totally against human freedom. And so they try to disguise this by the fact that, oh, we're just going through this inevitable cycle. There's nothing inevitable about it. It's merely putting strict controls on the amount of money in circulation and not letting the banks control this boom and bust cycle, which they're always prepared to buy up the assets during a bust period for pennies on the dollar because they can create the money out of nothing. I know this sounds like some type of a conspiracy fantasy, but that's just the way it is.
Now, some people might be thinking, well, why not just legislate then? Governments can just, enact some new law, whatever it happens to be. And I know you've been very much on top of the recent UK parliamentary debate along these lines. But as you alluded to a moment ago, it's not quite that simple because the banks have a tremendous amount of control, some of it more overt than others. But particularly in the US, we see this in the form of lobbying and also the revolving doors, people often say, between Wall Street and DC. So this complicates things immensely, and it makes legislating tricky, to say the least.
Well, of course, if you saw any of that recent debate in the British Parliament, you saw that, out of perhaps a capability to seat 400 or 500 people, there were a grand total of about 20 members present. So although it was a really groundbreaking debate, that this was actually so forthrightly discussed openly on a televised legislative session, it was still very lightly attended. And it's lightly attended because the banks are basically in control of the political system, and I'm sure they told many members, "Oh, this is just conspiracy nonsense, and we're going against economics orthodoxy." And well, economics orthodoxy, that's one of the tricks of their trade. They totally control all the economics journals as well, and this was an excellent piece in the New Yorker magazine about 3 years ago, how the Federal Reserve in the United States virtually has a lock on all the economics journals as well, through a variety of different methods of paying off the leadership of all the journals, so that no true monetary reform article or opinion could ever get in any of the 7 or 8 major economics journals in the United States. So they're controlling the academic process as well to squash any type of opposition to their debt money system.
Yeah, I remember doing economics at high school grade, and I was very skeptical from the outset because what the teacher was putting across seemed to me to be divorced from actual physical reality, which of course it was. And I thought it was very telling that I was a student at a time when there was a stock market crash here in the UK, and we went in the next day to class. And I don't know about you, Bill, but if I was an economics teacher, that I would have said, right, cancel everything else. We're going to talk about this because it's a big economic event. Not a word of it. She seemed to be maybe loosely aware that something had happened, but certainly didn't want to talk about it.
Well, it's because they can't talk about it because they don't understand it. And even high school kids would be able to poke holes in their various theories and ask some questions which would cause them a great deal of discomfort because they would not be able to answer.
We're talking about the bankers and banks here, and sort of it all seems very, I don't know, shadowy. It's kind of like, who are these people? In your experience, how centralized and interconnected is this system? And how many people and what sort of people are we talking about? I mean, there must be somewhere guys in offices, maybe right on the top floor of a skyscraper, who are pulling these levers, and yet I suspect that they're deliberately obscured.
Well, yeah, I mean their whole modus operandi is to remain in the shadows, and they literally are on the top floors of every major skyscraper in every major city across this planet. That's well, who do you think builds those skyscrapers? It's bank money created out of nothing. Either that most of those skyscrapers have a bank's name on the side of them. Some of them are major corporations, but all those major corporations are financed by bank lending. So yeah, it's interlocking. It's a great gig if you can get it. It's a $1 trillion a year Ponzi scheme, a multi-trillion-dollar a year Ponzi scheme, and it's going to pay them to keep the rest of us confused or in the dark. And by confused, I mean they're still today, you still hear people argue that, oh, the way to fix this is return to a gold standard money system. And this is just nothing but a smoke and mirrors. We were on a gold standard money system throughout the 1920s. Did that control the quantity of money during the Roaring '20s when the American stock market surged on a percentage basis more than any other time in history? No. The banks were creating money wildly out of nothing. And of course, this ultimately led to the great monetary crash of the 1930s and the Great Depression. Once again, we were on a gold only money system during that time. Did gold save us then? No, it did not. It's not what backs the money that is important. What is important is who controls the quantity. If through some mechanism, we the people gain control over our sovereign money systems, then we can control it equally for the benefit of all citizens. Right now, that's not the case. It's disguised as being the case. You hear politicians every day on television say, oh, the government is printing money wildly. The government is not printing money wildly. All of this money is created as an interest-bearing debt by commercial banks for their benefit.
Yeah, you mentioned the gold standard, and I mean, maybe even as recently as 5 years ago, I might have been in favor of that, in theory, because the idea of backing money with something of real substance and in a limited quantity had an appeal. But actually, I've since worked through it, intellectually, and of course, it's not, as you say, it's not the answer. But you mentioned the tally sticks system earlier, and how it's more important to control, as you say, the quantity of money. But of course, there are problems with government money as well, because the obvious temptation would be, if a government was in control of printing money, creating the currency, as it does for roughly whatever 3% of it that's actual notes and coins, that the temptation would the government to go berserk, particularly against the background of the system that we've been living under, because governments have got used to be able to spend beyond their means.
Well, yeah, but if you're also in control of the money supply, then you can also be in control of government borrowing. No government should be allowed to borrow anything, not one penny, not one nickel, not one farthing from a bank. Because why would a government borrow when a government can create the money it needs? Now, there are hundreds of different ways to control it. There have been experiments down throughout history, and they're continually squashed by the banking complex. And if you look at it, people run out the example of, the inflation, the wild inflation of the Weimar Republic, or the wild inflation of the continental currency during the American Revolution. But do you know how many hyperinflation examples there have ever been throughout world history? This is a known number by economists. It's less than 50 50. The examples of hyperinflation are far, far, far fewer than the examples of deliberate deflation of a money supply, which always benefits the bankers because they can create money at will and buy up assets for pennies on the dollar. So everybody's all scared about inflation, but inflation is relatively easy to control compared to bankers deliberately withdrawing money from the money supply for their own benefit. I mean, if we're on a system where governments could not borrow, then it would be relatively easy to control spending, because if they overspent more than their income, they would have to immediately raise taxes. And this would be very unpopular, and they would immediately be forced out of office and lose their jobs. So to me, the absolute key, step number one, to understanding this system and solving it is no more national debt, which is the title of my last book. You have to forbid government borrowing, and then and only then all other remedies flow from that.
Yeah, that's a key point, actually, because I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, some of them somewhat apocalyptic in tone. I've listened to a lot of conservative talk radio in the US, and this hyperinflation, so-called, this has been predicted for a long time. I mean, back in my lifetime, back since the days when Reagan was in office, they've been talking about this, and it's always imminent. It's always just around the corner. There's going to be hyperinflation. Gold and silver prices are going to go to the moon. And, well, we're still waiting. You know, I'm a silver investor, and it's like the prices in the toilet at the minute is terrible. And the other thing is, in all of that, is exactly your point about having to raise taxes. That would have huge implications for things like launching wars and what have you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would pretty much eliminate massive warfare, because you'd have to either raise taxes to the moon, or you'd have to completely cut government spending. So yeah, it would cause a much more peaceful society, and ultimately people would become government officials would become much more responsible with the money they spend, because right now they can just issue bonds, which is nothing but more government borrowing, and finance their overspending that way. And it's much more easy to disguise the overspending if you're actually just saying, well, we just issued a few more bonds. We'll pay it back, a generation later, long after you're dead. And so that's an easy way for people to ignore the problem and continue this cycle of overspending and continued borrowing.
I mentioned earlier about learning economics, well, what passes for mainstream economics at school. There does seem to be incredible economic illiteracy. It's not taught in school. I'm talking about not the theoretical stuff, but that's the day-to-day, how the system works. Not only are most adults quite ignorant about the system that you're outlining, but actually even people like politicians and some bankers who you would expect to know about this stuff, how money is created, have got no idea. So that in itself, I guess, is what you're doing with your work, is trying to say to people, hey, this is how it works. And when you understand that, maybe there isn't much you can do practically to unwind the system, but it makes a hell of a difference if you grasp the basics of this.
It's something that came out in the parliamentary debate that I just hit with my my last YouTube on that, was the very well-informed young gentleman that kicked off the debate basically said that he doesn't think the system can be changed and until it has been tested to destruction. He's an aeronautical engineer, and so tested to destruction is a very interesting term that you never hear in economic circles. In other words, he knows the system's going to eventually crash, and he thinks nothing can be done until this an additional massive amount of pain is applied. And he may be right, but I prefer to think that he's wrong. I prefer to believe that we can reform the system before such a crash by educating people to the basics, that it's not working, that all money is created as an interest-bearing debt, and we just don't have to do it that way. This does nothing but cause not only economic cycles, but cycles of war.
given that this system isn't like some kind of Frankenstein's monster, badly designed, but basically innocent, stumbling around, we just need to. There are very powerful vested interests here. And I do wonder that if the system is not to be, as you described, tested to destruction, if it can be reformed, what that looks like, just given those vested interests. Because the control, as far as I can see, I'm thinking back to what I was saying earlier on about the environment and war and what have you, everywhere you go, underlying it is that those vested interests and that stranglehold of control.
Yeah, and they have to keep up confusion, and it's in their interest with this multi-trillion-dollar income that they have from just simply creating money out of nothing. It's to their interest to pay hundreds of billions of dollars to keep the people of these nation states confused with what is the real cause. The real cause is that nations are allowed to borrow money, that banks get to create money out of nothing and pretend that there's something called fractional reserve lending, pretend that they actually have some type of assets backing all this lending, when in fact this is nothing but a curtain, the Wizard of Oz curtain in front of the wizard, and they're just creating the money willy-nilly as they see fit, and they will continue to violate these laws whenever it suits them to do so. And it's if you tell people that the system has to completely crash and burn before anything can be done, then that removes all hope. It removes the incentive of people like you and I from actually taking our time to get on the radio to try to inform people. So I really don't think that that's a wise choice on this gentleman's part to try to say it has to be destroyed before it can be reformed, because without hope, the people will not spend the time to try to resist. They will not spend the time to try to reform. They're just going to retrench into their corners and get as much as they can for themselves and not operate in the public interest like our parents had to do for example, during World War II. There's just everything is so me-oriented right now. It's very little in the public interest work going on. It's being seen as an oddity when instead it has to become the norm if we're ever going to get our freedom back and bring about some type of sustainable monetary system that isn't really some Frankenstein monster that's ultimately going to destroy the world.
Facing the prospect of an apocalyptic meltdown, the fear of that becomes greater than just muddling along under the current system, which might be immoral and corrupt, but it's kind of like, hey ho, nobody died, and people are worried about what a catastrophic crash might look like. One thing I've thought, like if you and I set up in your garage and decide to start printing $33 notes and spending them at the store, pretty soon we're going to be behind bars. And when I looked at particularly in the wake of 2008, the crash and all the misdemeanors of senior bank figures, that rather than just fining this entity, the bank, an amount of money, which again, in the context we're talking about, you have to ask where the money for the fines came from. We need to start putting individuals in jail. If people actually thought, just my take on it, if they thought they faced a prospect of a personal comeuppance, they might make different decisions. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, as a result of the 2008 crash and all the major banking scandals, there's not been one major banking official that's gone to jail. Bernie Madoff, who ran a hedge fund, and a couple of his boys, Madoff is in jail, but he's not a bank. And so, the banks control the folks who make the laws, and they can always find some way to wriggle out. And until justice is served, they're going to continue to do this. And what is justice being served anyway but government acting in the public interest, enforcing the rule of law, and instead of a fake rule of law, when in fact, really, it's just the law of the jungle. He with the biggest bank account rules. He with the biggest against guns rule. That's not the recipe for human freedom. Human freedom is a system of laws, so we can keep these type of crooks at bay.
What was your take on the events of 2008 and subsequently in terms of the banking system? Was it a stress crack appearing in the system globally as a result of some of the flaws that we've discussed? Was it a consolidation? Was it actually quite good for the banking system, or was it a bit of both?
It was probably just wild leverage, wild money creation. Derivatives were relatively new, and they just got totally out of hand and crashed the system, would be my best guess.
I've noticed in recent times, and I think it's not insignificant that it's happened since 2008, we've got organisations coming up now, like for here in the UK, for example, we've got one called Positive Money, and there are other equivalents in Europe. Maybe there's some things like this happening in the US, and it seems a popular grassroots movement to try and spread this information. And if you look at Positive Money, it's like sort of it seems quite conservative in a way. I don't mean that politically, but they're not radical people. It's not a sub-terrorist organization, but the information they're putting out, that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, as far as my reading of the situation is concerned. So that's a really good development, I think.
Yeah, Positive Money is doing a great job. The problem with monetary reform, there's nothing new about monetary reform. I mean, this battle has been literally going on for at least 1,000 years, and the bankers are smart, and they eventually overwhelm the forces of those people trying to make governments operate in the public interest and bring about a new form of debt money system, and back and forth it goes. It's changed hands 7 different times just in American history alone. And so there really needs to be some type of organization operating in the public interest which perpetuates this knowledge of monetary reform. And that's why my videos have become popular, because the basic theme of what I've done is just go back into history and shown that this is the same battle over and over again, century after century. And so Positive Money is really a group of folks who have pooled a bunch of money to fund Positive Money to perpetuate the study and effective political implementation of a system of monetary reform, so that this is perpetuated down throughout generations. The monetary reformers used to meet at a place in Western England called Bromsgrove every year, but the facility was small. It only set 55 people. I was invited many years and just didn't have the money to go and speak. And finally, the very last year that Bromsgrove ran, I had the money to go, and I gave the keynote address there. And I've put that address up on YouTube and subsequently at the tail end of the Secret of Oz video. So Positive Money is really the first and at least the most organized, well-funded effort at perpetuating this knowledge of monetary reform. And I think they're doing a great job, as evidenced by they were the first ones to really push through this debate on the floor of a major legislature.
Bill, you've been on this road for a long time. You keep putting one foot in front of the other. Presumably you feel that you are getting somewhere, however frustrating it may be at times. What's your sense talking to members of the public? I don't know if you've ever had a chance to have conversations with bankers or politicians, just that the progress that has been made in the spread of this information and these ideas, over the last 10, 20 years, however long you care to comment on.
Well, just in the last 2 or 3 years, and I've never traveled so much. I've met prime ministers and presidents just in the last 3 years. This was absolutely unthinkable 5 years, much less 10 years ago. I met a member of Congress just a week ago. And he was very interested in this topic. And this is unheard of 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So it is spreading. It's a grassroots effort. That's why I target the internet through YouTube with this knowledge, because these videos of mine will hopefully remain up on YouTube long after my death, just continuing to influence people and educate them. And there'll be other people coming along, who build on that knowledge. And there are many different ways of implementing this, and people will explore all of these. And I just hope that we don't have to take the system to destruction before we really get some solid results. And I think we will probably be able to get some solid results pretty soon. I know the people in Israel take a very simple, practical approach to it, and that is that what you need to do is just pass a law. Well, next year we'll only have 10%. We'll have, instead of 3% of the money supply being created by the state and 97% being created by banks as interest-bearing debts, we'll have only 90% created by banks, and allow 10 whole percent of the money supply to be created by the government without interest, in the public interest. And then we'll run metrics on how the economy does. And if it does well, then the next year we'll increase that. Maybe 30% of the money supply will be created by the government, and only 70% allowed to be created by banks. And they can take a gradual approach, and that doesn't sound radical or revolutionary. And, if they're going to test it with proper economic metrics and such as that, this is a very reasonable approach that I think will gain traction in the very near future.
I'm also encouraged by the rise and proliferation of local currencies and other methods for people to sidestep the system, not limited to, but including in the UK here, credit unions, for example, who do money lending on a very different basis, based on what they actually have, actual money deposited by members. And I don't know if there's any trends discernible in the US along those lines, but maybe these system sidestepping measures won't need to endure if we can reform the overall system. But it's just more evidence of people getting creative and educated about how things work and how they can do things differently.
Yeah, credit unions don't add to the problem, but they don't really fix the problem either. I mean, credit unions are the way all banks should operate. But that's not going to reform the system. Complementary currencies are good, and that's why I fully support cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Quark, because this is literally humans trying to go around this debt money system and create their own money. Unfortunately, cryptocurrencies benefit the creator greatly, because they're creating the money supply and then trying to pass it to other people so they can circulate it. So that's an imperfect system, but there are other ways of doing complementary currencies that are perfectly good. And I don't mind at all having gold money be a legitimately traded currency. Gold is very inefficient for trade, because you're never sure if you have 90% gold or 99.9% gold in a coin or whatever. So it requires assaying, and there's a problem. It's not as efficient. But if people want to use it, I think that's just fine with me. So that's kind of my take on all that. Here in the United States, since we do have a state system, and Congress is only provided with certain powers, and the other powers are given back to the states in theory, although that has been eroded in the last few years. But the system still exists, and I think we're going to return to it to a greater degree. States can create their own banks. You don't have to have the Fed giving approval for the creation of a bank. The Fed has only existed 100 years. The United States has existed 230 some years, and for all of those years before the Fed, the only approval authority was the individual states. So states can charter banks, And for example, in the case of the Bank of North Dakota, a state chartered a bank for its own use and then owns that bank. It's called the Bank of North Dakota. And this bank operates completely in the public interest for the benefit of all the citizens of North Dakota. And if every state in the United States would create such a bank, then you could effectively bypass to a great degree the Fed system. The immediate benefit is then banks or states wishing to, let's say, create a large road network, a road project, would not have to go out to the New York money center banks and borrow money at interest. Their state-chartered bank could literally make the state a zero-interest loan, and thereby, for these major projects, typically it doubles or triples the cost. Most of the cost, in other words, goes to interest, and the state could completely avoid that, and thereby we could rebuild infrastructure in the United States to a tremendous degree and avoid the resulting state taxation. And that would be an excellent example of, gee, this is working at the state level. Why don't we do something like this at the federal level? And thereby we could bring about change.
Yeah, it's a bit like people taking out a $200,000 mortgage or whatever on a house, and they pay back $400,000-500,000 if they actually do the sums. But anyway, today, Bill, we've been talking about your documentary once again, Jekyll Island. Tell people where they can see that, any websites you want to share. You've got other films available, as we've mentioned along, and of course on YouTube, as you also mentioned, you do the Still Report on a regular basis.
Well, you can get some of those details on my website, billstill.com, and I'll leave the rest to you.
Okay, well, we'll have all the relevant links up on the interview page on the website for people. So, Bill, thanks once again for joining us on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you very much. I love the title. Legalize Freedom.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.